welcome to the first standalone Blitz of the Reich podcast, in which I talk about topics pertaining to the upcoming Operation Bagration documentary. Now, on this podcast, I am not really focusing on interviewing people like I've done in previous podcasts. Rather, I'm tackling a couple of misconceptions and myths in a more informal way, which you can listen to in your car or your radio, whilst you're driving to work or on the tube or whatever. So, to give a bit of an update on Operation Bagration, I've recently put out a community post saying that I'm about 4,000 words into the script. Now that means that the documentary will at least be 25 minutes. However, as I've already mentioned, this does not include the discussion of the operation itself or the aftermath, since I like to usually have conclusions that are, maybe full of a lot of speculation about the importance of the operation, because I in fact think that Operation Bagration was the most important battle/operation in the entirety of the Second World War. That's a very big claim, but I think it's more important than Stalingrad, obviously than Moscow, even though I think Moscow was the turning point. Now, I'm not saying Operation Bagration was a turning point. I'm just saying it was the most decisive operation and the most brilliant feat of strategic planning and tactical maneuvering that I've seen in the war, apart from maybe the tactical maneuvering in Operation Barbarossa. Now, I plan on having the operation to be in three parts. I'm having the sort of preliminary discussion of the context of the operation, mainly 1943 to 1944, to give good context for the viewer. I'll then be discussing the operation itself, which will probably take the longest. Maybe not, who knows. And then I'll have a small section on on the aftermath of the operation. I'll have to include other operations like in Finland, the Karelian Isthmus offensive, the Lvov-Sandomiersk operation will definitely be included with Operation Bagration itself because I consider it quite important. And of course, the aftermath operations like the Kishinev offensive, maybe the Battle of Budapest and stuff. So there's a lot of information littered here. It's pretty much kind of condensing the year 1944 for people. So that's quite important and whatnot. It's going to be about an hour long minimum, I believe. I've already written about 25 minutes, as I said earlier. And if the other sections, the section on the operation itself and the aftermath are anywhere at least, 20 minutes long, then it would mean that the operation that the documentary would at least have to be 60 minutes long. So it's 20, 20, 20, but it's 25, 25, 25, then it would be an hour and 15 minutes long, if my maths are correct. So in this podcast, I don't want to get too long because let me just check a second. Yeah, I don't want to make this such a long podcast. But I wanted to talk about a misconception that I've noticed with a lot of people. As you all know, my favorite general of the Second World War, at least on the Soviet side, was Konstantin Rokossovsky. He was one of the first successful generals to employ good defensive measures and tactics against the Germans in June 1941. Whereas this was, I believe, south of the Pripyat marshes. Was it the Southwestern Front, I believe, that he was attached to. Whereas you had people like Pavlov in the Western Front who completely was incompetent, and he was executed by Stalin a few days or weeks after the battle. We're discussing here, however, that a lot of people praise Rokossovsky, rightfully, for his defense of Kursk, for Bagration, his execution of the offensive by Bobruisk and whatnot. I believe he controlled the first Belarusian front. I'm not entirely sure. But people make it into a competition, especially a lot of military historians make it into competition where they try to rank the Soviet generals by their order of their skill, but they do it in extremes. Now, in one extreme, people view Konstantin Rokossovsky as like this great general, which he was, but as a consequence, a lot of people tend to view Georgy Zhukov as sort of a bit incompetent or maybe overrated in the way he is portrayed in the war, right? He was in the victory parade in May 1945. He led the parade, and he was given so many jobs and stuff, and people highlight his disasters like Operation Mars and the rise of salient in late 1942, early 1942, and early 1943. Rightfully so. However, a lot of people tend to fail to realize the significance in how Georgy Zhukov sort of enhanced the battle doctrine of deep battle, right? I believe he was a protege of Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Russian Civil War commander, who really emphasized on fast strategic redeployments. Sorry for adjusting. Throughout the Russia, because Russia's such a huge country, you kind of need to rely on strategic redeployments that are swift and mobile in order to defend the peripheries of your nation. I've already covered this in my deep battle doctrine video, even though I'd like to do an update with Iserson and Triandafilov, however you pronounce his name. However, I also mentioned this in the video on why Russia won World War II about 65, 63 years before, because of the importance of reserves in your periphery. But other than that, Zhukov was his protege, and whereas everyone else was failing to produce results in campaigns, maybe like in Finland especially, with what was the commander's name? Voroshilov. The incompetent guy known as Voroshilov. Tukhachevsky had won a resounding victory in Khalkhingol against the Japanese with a joint Soviet-Mongolian force in which he employed a lot of BT medium, well, I consider them medium tanks, some might say light tanks, in a very nice style akin to deep battle, the deployment of mechanized forces to exploit an enemy army via penetration. And the result of this was thousands of Japanese prisoners and effectively sealing, pretty much establishing a status quo in the borderlands of Manchuria that would last until Soviet offensive operations in 1945. Now, this is a very important development to me because this shows that he was one of the first commanders to really try to employ the concept of mechanized warfare, and albeit he didn't do it in the West versus the Germans or the Finns, but he still did it anyway in the East, and that led to kind of discussion pertaining to the advancement of Soviet doctrinal development, right? Now, Rokossovsky, he's brilliant as well, but he did have his blunders in a way, although some of these blunders were due to the Stavka and Joseph Stalin kind of insisting on a continuation of the offense. Such a case was Operation Little Saturn. Rokossovsky was in charge, I believe, of the Don Front, which was one of the fronts that encircled Stalingrad and kind of pushed Manstein away from the periphery of Stalingrad. But then this front became the, I believe it was the Central Front. I think it was the Central Front or the Western Front. I'm really bad at the front names, but I'm pretty sure it was the Central Front. And he was in charge of attacking Orel. However, his attacks also produced failure because of overextension, because of Stalin's insistence on attacking. And of course, the Third Battle of Kharkiv, which resulted in a massive Soviet defeat. Now, this was a pretty big blunder on his part, and even then, he did attempt for, even then in late 1943, early 1944, Rokossovsky even attempted for further offensives in the Belarusian sector before Operation Bagration. There was a total of 7 offensives with him and Bagration, I believe, in the central Belarusian sector that completely failed and left about 200,000 Soviet soldiers killed or, I believe, wounded. So this shows that Rokossovsky wasn't perfect either, but military leaders aren't necessarily perfect individuals. They learn from their mistakes and they mature as leaders, you know? Zhukov really played an integral role in the defense of Moscow in 1941 when he was the commander of, I believe, the Western Front. He successfully defended the capital, and it was only at the insistence of a broader offensive by Stalin that his offensive and his counteroffensive ended in sort of a defeat, or at least a stalemate, with the rise of salient. That's not necessarily his fault either, you know? People also point at Operation Mars as one of his biggest blunders. But you have to realize, in the rise of salient in Operation Mars, in concurrent to the developments in Stalingrad, he was traversing very difficult terrain, and there were a lot of valleys and forests and lakes, making the Ryazov area particularly hostile to motorized and mobile units. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't employ deep battle doctrine, you know? And also, Lend-Lease wasn't even reaching peak deliverable rate until late 1943. So whereas Rokossovsky was helped by the vast arsenal of U.S. Lend-Lease trucks in summer of 1944, Zhukov wasn't to the same extent. And, you know, American trucks were of higher quality than German trucks, right? But they just weren't there for the 1942-1943 action in the rise of salient, Operation Mars. So he had the difficulty of terrain. He had the difficulty of not having that many trucks. And also, there was forests and rivers. In the eastern sector, it's not Sychevka, I'm not sure, the eastern part of the rise of salient, there was, I believe, the Ugra River, if I'm not mistaken. The Soviets had to had to traverse this river and create a bridgehead, which would be very difficult with the concentration of the 9th Army in rise of salient. Of course, the Soviets had difficulty with the Cherkassy pocket in Ukraine in late 1943. However, in Ukraine is very easy for tank warfare and armored warfare, whereas the Ryazov area was kind of the area where there was a lot of rivers, the sources of a lot of rivers, like the Volga and the Ugra were located. So it's a bit high areas with a lot of maybe forests, lakes, not swampy like the Pripyat marshes, but definitely difficult. So there's a bit of a myth going on that, you know, Zhukov was a bad general, you know. Maybe he's a bit overrated, of course, but I wouldn't really call him a bad general, to say the least, you know. He had extenuating circumstances facing him in Operation Mars, whereas Rokossovsky had more resources available to him in order to execute deep battle the way it is meant to be executed. Now, here's another thing. Zhukov was a member of the Stavka, the High Command, right? And he actually did a lot of the planning in conjunction with Vasilevsky. I kind of call them the A-team of the Soviet Red Army, because they really both worked in conjunction with each other to plan a lot of the counteroffensives, like in Stalingrad, and I believe, and they also kind of coordinated Operation Bagration as well. So they almost deserve as much credit as Rokossovsky, at least for the strategic scope of the operation, whereas Rokossovsky was executing the operation. So there's a different dimension. Rokossovsky was more focused on the operational and tactical theaters of war, whereas Zhukov and Vasilevsky were planning the strategic scope of the offensive, which is just as important, especially since very few people knew about the overall nature of the operation. Rokossovsky didn't even know. It was really the workings of the Stavka High Command. So, this is just to show that Zhukov does merit some praise for his handling of Khalkhin Gol, whereas, in that same time period, the Soviet Red Army held war games in Moscow. Meretskov, the chief of staff, held war games and they completely failed. So Zhukov was actually outperforming his fellow commanders, concurrent to, during the defense of the Soviet borderlands next to Manchuria. So he was already winning battles using basic principles of deep battle, and in the face of onslaught in 1941 in Operation Bagration, he did, in fact, defend Moscow adequately and skillfully. He launched a counterattack, which was then further forced by Stalin, resulting in a Toropets-Kulm offensive in mid-January, and a secondary general offensive, I believe, that started in January the 7th, 1942. So, it's not entirely his fault. But Operation Mars, it could be because, according to NKVD agents, they tried deceiving and diverting German forces to the rise of salient instead of Stalingrad. I don't necessarily buy that. I've done that in a video on Operation Mars, a documentary. That being said, I think he had a lot of difficulty with the terrain, especially the forests, the valleys, that were not good for armor formations. And he had difficulty with the fact that there was a river that he had to establish a bridgehead on in a swampy area. It's nothing like the Cherkassy area in the Dnieper in Ukraine, because Ukraine you have the river barrier, but on the other side it's just plains, it's just steppe. So it's a bit unfair, the criticisms that come from people regarding Operation Mars. Of course, he did make blunders, like all generals, but that's just a little thing I wanted to tackle for you all to enjoy whilst I work on the first part of Operation Bagration. I'd like to thank you all for your constant support and, affection for my videos, toward my videos. It really means a lot. We are approaching right now nearly 9,000 subscribers, and we've already hit 1 million views on the channel, so I'd like to congratulate everyone as well, because you're the ones who make this happen. To conclude the video, I would like to talk about some other plans I have for the channel. These documentaries take a long time, and I know that I post them about once a month and a half, and sometimes that's not enough. It's mainly because I edit on PowerPoint. It's a bit time-consuming and difficult to edit animations. I like to make my videos visually appealing. I don't like dragging the script on for the sake of, making a longer video. I really like focusing on the visuals more than anything. To give a preliminary reading to people who are interested in further, researching these topics. I've established a company for this YouTube channel. It's called Maskirovka House, with Maskirovka meaning, Russian military deception. And I am planning on making it into a free, obviously ad-based, online sort of newspaper talking about Russian history, Russian politics in the current day. The objective is to make this into a sort of a think tank of some sort, of a research center, just to pump out nice research material of journalistic integrity on Russia. And that being said, I'm currently, seeking collaborators and contributors. Right now, I don't really have much revenue coming in, so I can't really pay anything, but I'm obviously working for free as well. That being said, if people want to share things, I'd be happy to link back to their websites, maybe, if it's appropriate, the YouTube channels and whatnot. But that's a big plan. I'm working on this website as well. It'll have probably an online store where you could purchase maybe future books that I might read, that I will write, future books that I'll write, future products that I'll have, maps and whatnot, my Patreon link and everything. So it's just a little update in case anybody wants to find out more about that. Please just put a message in the comment section and whatnot. So this was the first podcast I'm doing in this sort of series, so that I don't have to edit so much, visually edit, and I could give you all more content to consume and whatnot. I hope you all like it, and please put your feedback in the comment section, and I will see you next time, hopefully when the first part of Operation Bagration has been released. But if not, I will definitely find other ways to keep the flow going, if you know what I mean. So that being said, thank you everyone for watching, and have a great Easter. And for all those non-Christian people out there, have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys soon.